Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Lucid, and I'm joined once again by Sai.
Hi,
Yeah,
I'm
so
Sai.
we got another turn of expansion here to do with you. Whereas we've been going terribly slow. We're slow, appropriately paced, but taking our time. You know, we'll probably pick up the pace a little bit on these expansions. We'll watch probably most the first set of battles, but then we'll pick up the speed a bit after that. There's one thing I wanted to mention, right? I guess we'll do it when we get to the Arca, not to the Arca, to the Pythium turn, which is the Pythium player actually sent me a kind of interesting message in Discord after I had mentioned that we had already recorded turn 3. And he asked about what we thought about the retarius expansion. And I was like, Sai and I didn't know what you were doing. And so he's going to try it again here. He's going to hit this exact same Barb province. And apparently the reason he did it was because he was planning on sniping the commanders, which he noticed are at the front of the formation when he pinged it.
Right. So barbarian lords typically, or the barbarian commanders in general, typically will be at the front. And I think that's true of undisciplined indie commanders in
Yeah.
general. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I think that Bone Tribe guys have that too. So in this case, it got routed by
Yeah.
Smite. But in the previous battle, he actually did take out at least, I think he took out either one or two commanders with his
Yeah.
Retarii already.
He took out one of them. Yeah.
The downside of doing it in two waves. Yeah, so the downside of doing it in two ways like this is that you get that extra attrition from the guys that
Right.
dealt or took
So
damage.
even though they hardly made combat or contact here, and it says only one of them died. If we go look at that province, you can see there's only 3 Retarii here because yeah, if they dealt or took damage, they're gone because they're gladiators. This would have been kind of sick if he got it the first turn, right? Because it's a lot of resources. It's going to help power the rest of expansion. Bit of a oof happening later, but he's still got 2 high resource provinces in his cap circle, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, the other thing though, which we had been talking about, is that while the Retaria did work, for barbarians in general, Pythium has
Right.
the javelin option, which tends to be just a little bit more efficient for fighting that
Yeah, you
particular
just
populace.
slam these, and it's still, even at 9 resources, it's still hard to get like a truly critical mass. But especially if you have smite, which will preferentially target the barb lords, because these guys have 15 hit points and these guys have 13. I'm imagining javelins plus smite, you have a pretty good chance of routing these guys before they tear your dudes apart. With even with like 20 millites, I'm guessing, but I haven't tested it, so I don't know.
Yeah, or at least that's the mindset that you should have when approaching these shieldless low
Right.
protection province types.
And then they expanded up here with the competences, which are pretty sick. They lose a couple of them, but you can see they just, I mean, think about at half the number of indies, they take 2 losses and kill them off. It's pretty sick. They're good troops.
And a large part of that, I would say, is their shield, because tower shields
Yeah,
are
they
incredible
really
against
are.
crossbows.
Yeah, that 7 parry makes a big freaking difference. And I mean, it helps in melee too. They've got 17 defense. That's nothing to sneeze at. They're going to be blocking a lot of the melee shots. And then slightly better than average attack combined with the broadsword. I mean, their attack and defense are a lot better than Indy's. 12 attack, 16 defense, compared to this heavy infantry. 11 attack, 12 defense. It's a, it's a pretty big split. Okay. So, well, I guess we'll watch this real quick so we can see that in action.
Yeah, the only downside to these
Right,
guys is basically just their cost. With a 15 gold price and very high resource cost, these guys
right.
can be very hard to mass. So while you do have those like elite stats, and they also even have a better than normal mat move, which is really the primary reason that you buy them, it's still, you are
Yeah,
paying for those extra stats.
that's true. They're not cheap. Looks like he's recruiting more competences and more Retarii. So that's the expansion plan is which is different than, in my opinion, also didn't really use the javelins here. And I think that's correct. I think if you're using these guys primarily as melee and you only have like 15 of them, the formation disruption you get from javelins outweighs the benefit of throwing the javelin. So you're kind of not doing javelin expansion if you go, in my opinion, if you go the competence route. But if you do the millites or something, that's when having like 50 javelins makes a really big difference.
Yeah. It's also worth noting, if you look as
Right.
to where he's expanding, that he's contesting the space between him
Right.
and TNG
And he
first.
particularly went to get this province because it's a large
Um,
province that also has fresh water. So you can see it's a very valuable province. This is going to go up to about 100, probably 160 gold once he gets rid of the unrest and gets his scales in there. So, well, his scales aren't that good, so maybe only like 130.
Yeah, and because he has heat, it's
Yeah.
gonna drag that down by a little bit. So yeah, I would estimate in the 130 range. But yeah, you'll also notice that Water Province is impassable, so he has to cut back through his cap circle, which might be planned if he plans on reinforcing in order
Right.
to take that heavy cav province
Yeah, because wait, this isn't heavy. Where's the heavy cap province you're looking at? Oh, this one.
in his
Yeah.
cap circle. Yeah, so he can basically reinforce with his expansion party that's already out, plus his cap army in order to take that. Or he might just keep going to his
Mm.
east and contest the border with Arco.
Yeah, this doesn't have horsemen either. You probably can take this. You are getting into the area where if this isn't 50, if this is more like 60, yeah, it's like,
Yeah, then you're gonna
yeah,
run
and
into some trouble with only
right,
13 guys. Yeah, the safer play
right,
from here is definitely to reinforce from his cap. But yeah,
right.
we'll see which one he decides to go with. Because I think either option is viable. Like you have the riskier one where you try to contest that territory
Right.
between you and Arco first, or you have the one where you basically get to push up into
Right.
your border with TNG first.
Okay. Speaking of TNG, we got a message from them. My cap circle forest, province number 100, has a death site, but I'm thrilled by the high resources, already making 5 ancestors and 4 barb heavy horsemen per turn. The horseman apocalypse begins early this game. Diplo has already revealed every nation's start. Pythium is an unfortunate neighbor, given my decision to take no poison resistance on the Bless. Also, well, no, they do get decent nature mages.
Yeah, but they do need to spend the gems
Right.
on buffing
Right.
poison resistance,
I'll
which
need
is
to
what
side
he's saying.
search nature early,
Yeah.
as fighting them will burn a lot of nature gems. Arethia would be very happy to drive. I'd be very happy to drive off the land, but I would need Atlantis's help to take their underwater provinces. Also, well, yeah, that's true. I was gonna say they can also do poison resist foul vapors, but that's not really something they do very well.
Yeah. No, they would need to get a
Yeah,
Pearl Mage and a Nature Booster. So that's relatively late
right.
in the game for Arith.
So I'm not excited about the first war with them. Land between me and Ulm is relatively rough terrain and low income, especially in their cap circle, so I'd prefer to not spend my rush potential attacking them. So I'm planning to focus my expansion on favorable borders with these 3 mentioned powers, and then aim to rush Midgard, probably with the help from Agartha. I'm guessing Vedheim and Pangea will be busy dogpiling Mictlan, so I don't expect much help or raid vulturing from them. If I don't fail any expansions, I'll likely be ready to ride several turns before Agartha, and I'll need to decide whether to take thrones or ride to war alone. Trying to decide research priorities for that matchup, I'll need a way to immobilize Vance to negate their defense. I'm not sure whether 4 Nature 2's casting web is good enough or whether I need to wait for Earth Power Earth Meld. Conjuration 3 Alt 2. It's a stretch for me if I ride early, like turn 10. That decision will determine the kind of mages I make during expansion.
Yeah, the other thing though is that the nature mages are a
Yeah.
little bit more flexible because if he does need them to be his poison resist casters, they can do that as well. The earth mages are generally better though, both because, as he pointed out, earth meld is a much, much more reliable way of locking down
Yeah.
defense tank units.
Where's Web?
But
Is
then
it
the other
evocation?
advantage of that
Yeah, here it
is,
is.
yeah, Evo 2. But then the other advantage of that is that those same Earth Mages can do Legion of
Yeah.
Steel and Strength of Giants, which are kind of
Power
like your
spike.
early
Yeah.
combat swing buffs.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's going to be an important consideration for him.
I like that he's
Yeah,
thinking about that early. Because like picking your first war based on your research timings is, in my opinion, one of the most important
right.
parts of the early game.
Well, you also like to mobilize your mage core for a first war.
Yes. Whenever I'm
Right.
playing something where it fits. And I think TNG is one of the nations where it does, especially because this particular player is like, he took a build that is intended to thug out some of his mages. So with that in mind, getting some early experience stars on the casters can actually be valuable just for
Yeah.
boosting their attack and defense, which normally doesn't matter
Yeah,
for your
that's a really good
combat
point.
casters.
So, okay, we'll see what he does here. I don't think there's too much else to talk about. He's clearing up his cap circle to get more resources, and presumably, especially with this order scale, even once he's maxed out, which sounds like he already has, his ancestor vessel production, he's just going to be hitting the barb heavy horseman button. So It'll be pretty interesting to see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what TNT
You
likes
know,
to
the
do.
other thing that's kind of interesting with his playstyle is he might be able to, you mentioned big horseman blob. I think if you attack Van, you have them on fire and you just let the Vans come to you. And that's actually a pretty good formation for like protecting Mage Core, your Mage Core that's going to be sitting there casting web at everybody who gets close or, Earth Meld. So,
Yeah, you can also get a really good concave formation going, especially if you have some sort of bait that can
right.
draw the cavalry in. And then, once you've got them surrounded, which, you should be able to easily
Right.
outnumber Van Sacreds, then you're going to have a really good time.
Okay. Coming up to Arethia, do we have a message from them? No. Marignan and Vettiheim. I'll have to remember that. They expand out here and they're using a few of their sacreds as their starting army. Cold Bolt's coming out.
I think that's just the indie mage.
And these guys fighting right through the web. I know we're thinking about this web another time, but yeah, you can see the web doesn't actually mess up their ability to attack. It's really just the defense malice, which gives them minus 75% defense. But they're still very capable of fighting with the net on them. So,
Yeah, especially since those spear guys are repel tanks
right.
rather than defense tanks.
So they've still got a lot of layers of protection. They've got the
Yeah.
protection, then they've got the repel. The defense is going to be reduced to 0 while they're netted, and then these guys have awe. So a lot of things going on there.
Yeah, and Ichthyans are one of the easiest province
Yeah.
tokes you'll find in LA.
Yeah. I will admit, when I first saw this battle, I was like, oh shit, these guys are in trouble. Once they all got netted up, but it just worked out for them. And the god coming through, he's casting Earth Might.
Yeah, I mean,
Right. Which is
he's
nice
not
with
in
all
any
these
danger.
attacks. It's going to just let them.
Yeah, if you're not seeing this guy charging into like Bone Tribe or a ton of heavy cav, he's gonna
Right.
be just fine.
I mean, he has taken a decent amount of damage, and he had to pass some affliction rolls here, but he's fine. He lost
Yeah,
20 health out of 120. He's this province was no sweat for him.
and that's just the
Right.
crossbows walking up close. Once they get close enough like that,
Yeah.
they can land their shots pretty reliably. But yeah, the Merm should be just a province a turn. Similar to Pythium's choice to kind of advance towards TNG, here we're seeing that Erythia is advancing towards Atlantis because he does actually have lots of options for this Merm because it's quite mobile. So it should be able to move two provinces in as long as, it doesn't have any like cold or terrain blocks. So he is actually going for the
Yeah.
contested region between him and Atlantis, which is a little bit of an aggressive move when you consider that Atlantis is one of the few other nations that can really benefit from those water provinces
Yeah, I
between them
think
and
it's a really
Erythia.
good move because this province in particular is so key for Atlantis because Atlantis can sail here, right? So they can potentially one turn reinforce this fort where all of a sudden one turn you'll see 300 units here or something, right? And the next turn, this army sails onto your capital. So there's not really a
Yeah.
lot of other places
At the
that
same
can happen
time,
from. It's not going to happen from this direction. So this is kind of like a early warning thing.
though, the fact that they can reach it from their capital also makes it a little bit harder for Erythia to defend
Right.
until they actually get that fort down. So I do agree with you, but it's something that like can is going to be very valuable defensively, but it also is a little bit of a risk in getting that fort up because that you have like that timer where Atlantis can disrupt
Right.
that fort construction, and losing your first
Yeah.
fort is a
It's a
huge blow.
super valuable province for both players, especially if they're to fight. So yeah, it's going to be really contentious, and it's easy to contend, for Atlantis. So I think, like you said, it's like high risk, high reward.
Yeah, and the other thing is that if they do want to
Right.
afford it, they need to do that early because the longer they wait, unless they see Atlantis going into another war, then it becomes even more dangerous because Atlantis is even
Right.
more likely to go try to nab that province. The only thing that I guess would ask is if they have diplomacy with Atlantis
Right.
yet, because if they agreed on their borders, then that kind of changes
I
things
don't
up a
think they
little bit
have,
as
but I know
well.
they've been sending messages, and there's been a lot of like turn 3 naps and whatnot. But I don't necessarily remember all those, so we'll have to see. Ghost King has not deployed yet, but Atlantis is expanding to the north. Pull this up.
Yeah, that Ghost King is gonna take a little while before he can go out because presumably
Yeah.
you wanna give them armor.
Now the Atlantis Ghost King can probably versus easier indies expand naked, especially if you were to get like alt 2 for Stone Skin. Or maybe for him, because I think he has that poison resistance bless, just picking up like enchantment 2 for personal regen or something.
Yeah, personal regen, bark skin. There's a
Right.
fair amount that you can do with that. And if he is going, or if he took water, then he can also do moss
Right, right,
body
right.
at all
So
three.
yeah, I think there's a lot of potential options this guy can do early, but it is nice to have some armor. All right, and I believe that brings us back to Pythium, who we've seen. So we'll come over a row or a column, and that brings us to Arcocephale, who's expanding with some Elephants. It's actually really well laid out in the formation
So
there.
the challenge, yeah, I was about to say the challenge with elephants is that you want them to impact the enemy either immediately after or at about
Right,
the same time as your army. In this case, it looked like the elephants could have basically just won this battle all on their own, but part of that was because the Indies were
right.
targeting Arco's
It
infantry
is perfect. He's
already.
got these guys who throw the javelins, and just as they're about to close, the real front line shows up, and just as they make contact, the elephant dies. I mean, you can't script that better, really. Or at least I couldn't.
Yeah. Because there's a little yeah, no, that was perfect, but because there's a little bit of variance in how the indies are placed, it can be
Yeah.
challenging to get those perfect hits.
He's making more heart companions out of the capital. So, little questionable, I think, because he's got the very weak
Yeah,
bless, if I recall.
yeah, that's something that we'd commented on before is that he's clearly is going for this like buff the heart companions because of their very high density. Undying gives them a little bit more
Yeah.
survivability in these fights, but they don't really have that much that actually makes them good against other units, at least as like part of their bless. Because dipping into that undying for like a cap only high resource cost sacred isn't great because even if they do survive
Yeah.
like survive in that battle, you still lose them afterwards. And the strength isn't nearly as impactful on heart companions in particular as attack, just because that's
Yeah.
both a defensive thing for them and something that basically gives them a percentage damage increase.
Yeah. I mean, the bless they have doesn't really make them that good at expansion. They're going to shine when you point buff them, right? Because they point buff really well to start with. And then the buffs that they have, like the resistance buffs, are nice. If you've got these guys who are almost impossible to kill with normal weapons, might as well make them immune to spells too with all the resistances. So, like, I see the thinking there. Just an
Yeah,
expansion. I think I'd make elephants and the cavalry and basically everything but hard companions.
yeah, especially with LA Arco, their
Yeah,
elephants are just so good. It's so easy to expand with those guys. And they take the same buffs that you're going to be putting on your heart companions fairly well anyways. Like they
right.
essentially become like, a variant air elemental once you put
And
body
you can see
ethereal on
clearly
them.
this player knows how to use elephants. I mean, this is flawless scripting. So
Yeah.
let's move on to Ulm because, as per usual, I think this is for all of expansion probably going to be my favorite nation to watch. So this is for those of you who missed it. This is the Fire Shield Regen Blood Surge Decay Weapons Bless on Ulm.
He
Right?
did mess up his scripting though, because you really do want these guys in the same square, just because that's going to be reducing the amount of
Yeah.
damage that they take dramatically. Because every time, look, if you have the hits divided between the two, then you're essentially having the
Right.
defense penalty that each guy takes. So by having them separated out like that, they're much,
Yeah.
much easier to overwhelm.
Major mistake there in the scripting. And I think the reason we can look at it again, I actually kind of want to deep dive. I think it has to do with the fact they're in the same tile. Only one of them can actually cast Bless. So this guy ends up blessing, this guy's holding. And I think that maybe that sets their turn timers off. Because I bet you if you look at it in the script, I bet you they look like they should go on the same turn. Like this round 3. Well, it's hard to say.
Yeah, no, it should. So even
Yeah.
taking that into consideration, I think Bless is just
Yeah.
100% cast time spell. So they go at exactly the same
That
time.
being said, my superstition, there's like understanding. Some players understand the rules of the game and they use that to make informed decisions. I'm much more of like an empirical player and operate largely by superstition. And what I normally try to do is if I have two guys I want to be in the same tile, I literally will never put them on to attack before round 5. I'm like, "You're gonna come walk up to me, and then we're gonna do it," you know?
Yep. I also like doing that during expansion because for most indie types, they have
Right.
units moving at different speeds. So spacing out the enemy army like that also just has an advantage of not
Yeah,
having everyone hit you at the same
absolutely.
time.
There might also be some benefit with the crossbows, because like, they're gonna be back taking pot shots at you, and then once the enemy gets close to you, which can take a long time, there's going to be a bigger distance between the infantry and the crossbow. And the crossbow are like, oh, fuck, we actually have to walk forward. And so then you get maybe like a full 3 or 4 rounds to sit there and pound on the infantry before the crossbow get in melee, like, close range. So,
Yeah, worth noting though, even with that failure, they still killed very significant
yeah,
portion of that province.
yeah.
Like they killed almost half the guys. Uh,
This, as we've talked about, can be a really strong expansion blast. I can't remember if we talked about it because we're actually re-recording this episode. Some audio issues.
we talked
We
about
did.
Stygian
Okay.
Skin when
Yeah.
we first saw it, which
Okay.
was a bit of a spoiler. Yeah.
But yeah, I would encourage anybody
But yeah,
who's
they should have a
interested in
pretty easy
this
time.
to make this blast with Stygian Scan and try expansion. Try playing this against the AI. See how the AI is at dealing with it. There's another thing that actually is kind of interesting. A lot of times, Sacred Cav is like around 90 gold more expensive than their mundane, like non-commander counterpart. But these guys are like, I think they're only like 50 gold more. Let me pull up the thing.
Well, yeah, the normal Ohm commanders are oh, you're
Yeah.
talking about compared to the
A
sacred
lot of
unit.
times,
I thought you were
I
talking
forget
yeah,
all the
okay, yeah, yeah.
sacred cat comparisons, but a lot of times they're way more expensive. These actually are pretty budget compared to what a lot of the other ones are. So, do they have the same encumbrance too? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they should have all the same gear.
But
And since they're cavalry, their encumbrance isn't
yeah, I
that
mean,
bad.
2 of these guys is a super cheap expansion party. When you can get that working, and if the AI can't deal with it, you're in pretty good shape. But that's all. I mean, it sucks they failed this, but it's a little bit on them. Arco pinging that heavy cap province.
Yeah, for these heavy cav provinces, it's definitely very valuable to see exactly how many heavy cav they have, just because that can change things so much. Like if you can have anywhere from like
Right.
5 to 20 heavy cavalry, and how you approach those is just drastically different.
Okay, let's keep moving. Jabalba. So one of the things I think we had talked about before was using some lures with the bats, and you can see they're doing it here. First of all, they got the hero that's summoning the Aussies, so we see an Aussie here, and they've got the lure of some reanimated long dead, which I think is awesome to see. Okay, they've killed one of the commanders, but there's 2 more down
Um,
here.
yeah, and unfortunately, one of the things that you're going to run into with Shabalba in particular is that because your bats are very often the lowest protection units on the field, they are going to be preferentially targeted by the enemies over
Right,
your long dead. So yeah, the only ones that are actually working as a lure are the ones that
right.
already got into melee, because the infantry that was near the commanders wants to hit these naked
Boy, are
bats.
they! And he got a little unlucky here with the Aussie not making it into melee because this guy he's been sitting here for like 3 turns, right? He would have killed probably 10 guys in that turn routed the army.
I mean, that said, he did rout
Yeah.
the army
But
just by
look, I mean,
killing the
the second he
commanders.
got here, you just delete an
But
entire
yeah,
tile. And then another tile. Well, not quite another tile, but yeah.
yeah. Once these guys are routing, they have such lowered attack and defense that they
Yeah.
do become a fair bit less threatening. Still definitely threatening to these Zot's warriors though, because Zotsub,
This
just
one
they don't have
Aussie
the
killed
stats
more
to
than all the
survive.
bats.
But the bats did kill the
Yep,
commanders, so
that's
they killed
true.
the important guys.
But this, I can't say they did anything wrong. It's just painful.
Yeah,
This is what Bats expansion is in Dominions 5, sadly. In Dominions 4, they used to get first strike and it wasn't so bad. But
I mean, in
yeah.
Dominions 4, it was nuts. So better too weak than too
Yeah,
strong.
probably. Well, yeah. This might I think it's a little
And
overtuned to the
yeah,
nerf now, but it's but this is the state of it. Yeah.
undertune, yeah, yeah. They can at least take out those Ichthyids relatively easily though, because those guys are similarly naked, so they actually do
Yeah,
die to
that's
bats
true.
fairly well. Not a great province, but
Yeah,
at
I
least
mean,
a
the other good
province
thing
that they
about
can
this Bob is
take.
they have a ton of farms near them. I mean, our forests and also a cave over here. So
Yeah, that's gonna be
right,
pretty nice for their foreign recruitment. Then the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that Xibalba is definitely
right,
amphibious capable. So, like, their mooch aren't fantastic units in general, but they can, take underwater provinces, make forts underwater. They don't really benefit as much, especially compared to someone like Joman that gets some of their best mages underwater. But if they do wind up needing to fight Erythia or Joman, they're at least not helpless when it comes to taking
yeah. I
those
mean,
lakes.
I think Joman's actually a great war target for them. I mean, if the opportunity strikes right, they have a very good opportunity to come in here and take this water system. And I mean, they could potentially, if they get in a really good position, even challenge some of the real water nations, but probably not for a first war.
Yeah, I think that Balba's first war should basically be the one that they're forced to take. It's just not a nation that really wants to fight early, just in part because it's one of the best scaling
Right.
nations, right? Because, you've got lots of flyers, lots of great mages, sacred blood summons, all that. But also because their units are just bad against
Right.
regular units for the most part. So if you're fighting as Xibalba, you definitely want it to be a magic versus magic war where things like elementals and sacred summons start mattering more than just baseline troops. Because if
Yeah.
they have to fight just, like bats versus samurai,
The
that's not a
only
fight
kind
you
of
want to take.
redeeming thing about that is
The
their
only
mages are flying, so they can kind of surprise you and show up with. I like they could have an enchant 3 timing where they're like, I raise skeletons, and they're like, okay, let's see if you can handle literally all my troops and all my mages, and we're gonna try to skelly spam you. And that can be just like and that's the kind of thing like you were saying with Utgard, like if he
Yeah, you can hit a timing
right,
with Shivalba's mages, absolutely. And they're not quite as good at it as Kalem, just because,
yeah,
air elementals are some of the strongest, like, early game magic you can use. But it's a similar idea where you just get all of your mages to the front line from
mhm,
your capital right away, and then get them back to reading books
right,
after you win that one
exactly.
critical battle.
So anyway, that's interesting. I mean, this also would be complicated by German's going to be having a Ghost King, which is well, if the Zabala has death mages, you can't really thug into that. Yeah.
Yeah, advance and cast,
Yep.
Ghost King gone.
So yeah, actually, I mean, it could be interesting. We'll have to see how this goes. Moving on to Joman. Here's these are the
Those are just the mercs.
550
Yeah,
gold
I
group.
don't know if we need to watch this. Yeah, this is just like more heavy cav versus fewer heavy
Yeah.
cav, so it should be pretty easy.
Doesn't lose anything, so he takes that, and then he's expanding over this way. I think this is a starting army with two of the samurai cav. The samurai cav get a little isolated here. One of them gets picked off. Their main defense is, well, defense. So getting surrounded by a bunch of Bakemono is not really ideal for them.
Yeah, they're also
Right.
fighting in the dark. I think this is a cave province,
Yeah.
so they do have a stat penalty
So
as
they
well.
take it. They lost 3 Ashigar and 1 samurai cavalry.
That's fine. I'm surprised that they didn't go for the
Yeah,
Amazons
this is
first, though.
easier. Also a much better
It's
province.
uh,
Yeah.
it's easier and also
That's
richer.
surprising.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know.
maybe they just want to
That's
making
true. That's
Bakemonos.
true.
Might
Because
be
I
it.
mean that
I will also say that this game has a lot of uncommon province types for an
yeah.
LA game. Like you're seeing those Crystal Amazons, Jade Amazons, like a lot of stuff that like if this were an EA game, would be like, oh sure, like we expect to see lots of these. But this many
Yeah,
Amazons in
that's
LA
true.
is very
That's very
uncommon.
true. Okay. So
Like aren't there I think there's four Crystal Amazon
Crystal
provinces.
Amazon, Jade Amazon, Bakemono.
There's two Crystal Amazons right next to each other
Right.
near Utgard, which
Yeah,
we
yeah,
we
yeah.
pointed out before to
Right.
the
These
Utgard
two. Yeah.
southeast.
The Zots over here.
Yeah, so this is just yeah, so this is so for the cave provinces, I kind of get it, right? Like stuff like Bakemono and Zots, you're gonna see a fair bit even in LA, just because like cave provinces are always kind of
Mhm.
unusual population types. But this many Amazons
Yeah.
is very unusual.
Very true. Okay, so we've come back to Arco and we've already covered them. That means we go over a row. And that puts us with Utgard. And oh my goodness, I think I remember this because,
Yeah,
like I'm saying, we've re-recorded.
yeah. This is kind of a tragedy and something that, in my opinion, really highlights the weakness of this bless. So with only Nature 7, the Gamherds just don't have enough durability in order to actually survive
Yeah.
prolonged combat. Like they just take too much damage. So obviously, heavy cav are fairly strong, but these guys would take too much damage from like light infantry. Like their protection is just so low, and they're relying on just having, enough hit points to just tank through everything. And because these guys are berserkers, once they get injured, they're in the fight to the finish. So if you get these guys into melee and you aren't winning the battle, you're going to lose every single
Which
one
is
of
what
them.
we're going to get to see here. So some notes on this. This could have been scripted better too. You The thing is your giants dying are going to contribute to an HP route. And in general, whenever you're fighting heavy cav, unless you're planning on taking no losses at all, you want the people who are taking the lance charge to not be in the same squad as anybody else. You want them to take the lance charge, die, and then get off the field. And then everybody else is in different squads, so their morale is mostly unaffected. If you use these guys to tank the lance
And
charge,
then,
you can, like maybe if there were some of them that had a bad affliction, like maybe this guy, you put him in the lance charge squad with like the rest of the humans. They eat the lance charge, but you don't want a lot of these guys tanking the lance charge because that's going to contribute to HP routing your army.
the other thing is that with using the size 4 giants alongside humans, if the humans are behind the giants, they'll
Right.
filter in and fill the squares. But if the humans start sharing a square, then the giants can't get in and
Right.
get that human plus giant square
So,
combination.
and you could just use the giants because, a giant is probably going to eat at least 2 lances, maybe 3. And, you could put a few of the giants up here to sacrifice them and then have another row of the giants with the humans behind them or something. But the other problem that he runs into here is his formation also isn't timed very well to make contact with the heavy cav. Because these guys are basically going to get a whole round of molesting these dudes before the Garms make contact. So,
Yeah, I'm not quite as upset about that because the Garms are, with this particular bless, they're really more for their offense than their defense, just because they can't survive melee combat with this minimal bless that they have. So just trying to use them as like kind of a hammer while something else is your anvil tanking the lances,
yeah,
does
but
make sense.
still, like with the
So
heavy
I,
cav, you're only going
yeah,
to get so many turns of tanking, right? So you want, while you're right, you don't want them tanking the
yeah,
hits. You want ideally the cav hits here and literally the second the cav make contact here, the Garms are right here, right? And if you look at where the Garms are when
yeah.
the contact is made, they're all the way back here. So they should be positioned 3 more tiles forward, maybe.
I don't think this one's quite that bad, but I think that the army just wasn't up to
Yeah.
taking this province at all.
Yeah, I think strategically, you're right. They shouldn't have tried to take the province. If they were going to, they might have been. I mean, this is a fucking scary province. This is a heavy cav province with 75 units. All right. You don't go into this with like a half baked army.
Well, sort of. I mean, I think the heavy cav are basically the only really threatening units in this province. Like with that many militias, you can HP route this pretty easily, as long as you can actually take
Yeah.
those 14 lance charges, which is
Yeah.
this army just can't.
Well, you know, quantity is a quality all of its own. So,
Yeah. And you can also see that Ukor doesn't have any other expansion going, even with some relatively easy
right.
provinces bordering his
And I
cap.
will certainly see him next turn. I mean, with this, you probably needed at a minimum 10 Garms per expansion party. And ideally, you have a few humans to jump in there and take the occasional hit. Because these Garms, like the region will start mattering more if they're not taking every single hit. Like if they get killed in 2 turns, the region doesn't matter. But if
Yeah.
there's a human in there to share a few of the blows, it'll help a little bit. And I'll give you this opportunity, Si, to talk about how you think he should just switch over to doing scales expansion because the bless isn't strong enough.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. Like with this particular bless, I would have just gone
Right.
Jotun Javelinist. Because they
Yeah.
expand fine in LA.
So yeah, you can do either, but we'll see in the turns to come what happens. Moving upwards and onwards, we have Vettiheim.
Who won the elephants not expecting to, which is interesting because it means that Gelman went all in on that heavy cav, but didn't place a similar priority on the elephants, which are also just really
Yeah.
good expanders.
I feel the heavy cav is a
So
little
he
bit more
did
of a
lose one of the
blunt
wolf
instrument
brothers.
of force than the like the elephants. You have to be a little more careful. The heavy cav, you can kind of just right click on provinces.
It's true. They're definitely easier to use. With elephants, you have to care a
Yeah.
little bit about positioning and so on. But you know, for stuff like this where they don't have heavy
Yeah.
cav or crossbows, they work just fine. And if you, I also think that the war elephants work a little bit better in conjunction with your
Right.
units. Like if you want
Yeah.
to combine them to take a hard province, just because they're so
Exactly.
offensively powerful.
Now this province he's trying to get with an assassin, but it hasn't
Assassins,
come to fruition
yeah,
yet.
right. But we know that his profit's there.
So hopefully it'll go next turn.
But this is mostly a scales build though. So the profit is really just like
Right.
to be a smite caster rather than, or I would assume rather than someone who can just like go toe to toe with a cavalry
Yeah, that's
commander.
probably correct. Yeah. Okay. So nice expansion for Vedheim getting 2 provinces. And that brings us to Micklin with his Jaguar build. And you had smack talk this build a little bit, but you kind of prefer the Eagle Warrior build.
I really do. I think that especially in terms of like defending against other players, it's just way more reliable. I mean, that said, he's not doing
Right.
anything fundamentally wrong. I also, and really my problem with this build hadn't been like the exact bless itself, or sorry, hadn't been the idea of the bless itself because it's
Right.
taking stats, which you want. It's got a decent spread. It's more just the very specific layout of the scales and the decision to
Right.
focus on Jaguars at all. But I think it is
Yeah.
doing what it's intended to do. I'm just a little bit harsh on Micklin
Right.
because I love this nation so much.
So, yeah.
I would probably be even harsher
Oh,
on a
gosh.
Caleb if we saw one.
You played Late Age Caleb much?
Yeah, well, a little bit, but
Yeah,
EA
it's
Caleb,
pretty cool.
favorite nation.
Yeah, you'd be terrifying with Caleb.
Yeah, it's my most played
Damn.
nation if you count blitzes.
Yeah, they're just so strong.
Yeah, so this is we talked about this Gath build before as well, that like it's set up kind of to be a blessed build,
Yep.
but it's really more of a scaled build. So it's an interesting idea of like, hey, we can afford more scales if we don't
Right.
need magic. So it's definitely not what I expected when I saw Drain Gath and not how I would run Drain Gath. Since this is actually like something that I did, gosh, I want to say that this was like shortly after Dominions 5 came out, is just like using these Isaacharite sages, but yeah, this is a very different take on it. So while I don't love it, it's still going to be
Yeah.
something that I think can be pretty cool, just as like an alternative like
Right.
way of playing this nation. So we'll see if this works out for them. It's just, I guess I have slightly managed expectations for how well they're going to do, mostly because if you're using a drain build, you need to build temples, right? Which are very expensive for
Right.
Gath. I think they're like 800 gold. So if like your researchers require temples, then you're very encouraged to use those any fort sacreds, and then in turn a little bit more encouraged to start using your blood mages. But we've gone over this before, so I won't
Yeah,
belabor
I
the
think
point.
the salient thing for us right now is that he's making scales troops. He's making these Gittite soldiers to expand, and he's making us Saccharate sages. So
And they're actually better than the Edomites that you get in MA because while they have very similar stat lines in terms of like, you know, just being like giants that throw javelins, they have much better morale.
yeah, 12 morale.
So yeah, these guys have 12 morale. The MA guys I think have like
Okay.
9 or 8. Like they have like really low morale to the point that they can like HP route your
Hmm.
army by mistake. Whereas these guys are not at all
Yeah, and these
suffering
just look
from
like
that.
really solid troops to me. So yeah.
Yeah, no, they're good. And May there's like a couple different nations like Nabah,
Oh my gosh. Oh, it's
Aphasia,
2 lava lakes
that like
in
do.
LA. This is huge. Getting a
Oh,
free
you're right.
4 gems. And that's like another capital. You know,
Without site searching. The other thing, which is really interesting about lava lakes in particular, is their water gems. And Gath doesn't have native water mages, but they do have Jade
Yeah.
Amazons. So this Gath is going to be a Gath that can cast a lot of water spells, which is
Right.
very unusual. So we'll see if he's going to be able to find a way to take advantage of that. Because to me, water isn't a path that you can naturally use to do really strong stuff early game. Because their elementals aren't the best except against like thugs or fighting underwater, which this Gath doesn't have like a really they don't have a good way to go underwater. They don't have underwater neighbors that they would like, you know, need to worry about that aspect of it. And none of their neighbors are particularly susceptible to water elemental spam either. So I'm not sure what they're going to be using that early water magic for, but they are going to have it, which is not something that's usually part of
Yeah,
Gas
I mean,
toolkit.
if nothing else, you can just site search with water and trade the gems to other people at a discounted rate. I mean, that's like you can't come up with anything to do. You can at least do that.
Sure. Yeah, and if Atlantis starts fighting Erythia and the two of them are spamming water
Yep.
elementals at each other, they'll be happy to buy them.
Okay. So that's Gaff. We've covered Utgard now. It means we go over a row and we're on the last row or column. And we'll go with Marignon. Oh gosh.
Yeah, and that's just
Yeah.
crossbows.
So this is a motley crew of expanders, I tell you what. Bunch of like these guys are limped.
Well, it's
You know, it's like four of the guys in the front.
I mean, this is just their starting army, so I don't think they
No, I
particularly
mean, this is
care.
their only expansion party, though. We are literally watching Marignon expansion.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying that like they aren't really going to begrudge these losses, and if anything, they're probably
Yeah,
happy that
that's
this
very
worked at
true.
all.
And on the capital, they're making more crossbows. And I know when we recorded this turn before, I was like, I got a bad feeling about this because there's really only one move they have. Their only move is to really combine forces here, right?
That's not true. They can sail.
That's true.
They also have the
Or they can
mercenary
maybe sail. Oh,
heavy
it's heavy
crossbows,
cav.
which are actually really good. They could sail into the Amazons, or they can take the Bakemonos. I'm not sure what I would do with Marignon in this particular situation. Like looking at their turn, I don't think that there's like a single obvious best move. I think that combining, given that they won that mercenary bid, combining to take that heavy cavalry province might be the best one,
Who
just
won the
because
mercenary bid?
it's something that they can. Oh wait, those aren't mercenaries. It says heavy crossbowmen in the province. That's not a Marignon unit.
Oh,
Heavy crossbows has to be either a mercenary company or
okay.
from
Yeah,
an
I've got
event.
no idea.
Do they have? Oh, they've got misfortune too, so it's probably not from their hero.
Yeah, I've got no idea.
Oh wait, no, it has to be from their hero.
Well, cool. Maybe they've got that guy.
Yeah, that's yeah. So if they have the last conquistador, he's actually an out of the box thug. He's basically like a heavy cavalry guy that comes with free heavy crossbows and can summon heavy crossbows. Then you're right, they don't have the heavy crossbow mercenary company. So the heavy crossbow event, like the only event that you get that can get them is where you hire them as mercenaries that attacks a neighbor. So I don't think you
Okay.
can get that in your capital. So those have to be from the hero, which means that he must have gotten the hero last turn and
Okay.
spent a turn
Cool,
summoning
cool.
them.
That's really good to know. Is that the guy with the super overpowered weapon too? I know there's somebody in Worthy Heroes who has a badass weapon. That's a conquistador.
I mean, most of the heroes do
No,
have
it's
badass
like an area
weapons.
of effect
Let
10
me
decapitation thing. Okay.
I don't remember that. I don't think that I put in a heavy or a mass decapitation
It's
weapon.
it's in Worthy Heroes somewhere. I thought it was on this.
I would have remembered
Parker was
that.
telling me about it, and I was like, huh.
No, he doesn't even have a magic weapon. Yeah, the most common weapon type for worthy heroes
Yeah.
is the like Hero's Blade or Hero's
Right.
Lance, like equivalent stuff, which are basically intended to be kind of
Right.
thematic of monster slaying.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this guy's very good defensively, and he has some magic paths that Marignon doesn't normally get access to. But he's not a guy who's fighting in melee or who's not doing anything in melee
Right.
other than surviving very, very well. Once he has some magic, like I
Okay.
mentioned, he is an out of the box thug. But for expansion, you're mostly relying on his heavy crossbows.
Yeah.
Because his retinue is really
I
good.
do want to mention, just as we close the Marignon part, that I am very uncomfortable with what their next move and expansion is. I just don't see a super great one. And it's very tempting to go after this super high income province in your cap circle that you really want to get. But cringe.
Did
I
he
don't think
ping it?
he didn't ping it this turn. He pinged it the previous turn.
Okay. Yeah, if he hasn't pinged it yet, if I were in Marignon's position, I would do that before attacking it just to get
Right.
a count of those heavy cav. And I would probably just either sail onto the Amazons or
They
take the
can't see
Bakemono.
these from sailing, right? Like they'd
Um,
have to have a scout there, right? Okay.
Right. Yeah. They don't have vision from sailing,
Right.
but they do trace income
So
from sailing.
they would probably have to. This is probably really important stuff to think out if you're Marignon. Like, where do you send your starting scout? Because if you get in some weird situation like this, where the normal expansion options kind of suck, you might have to do something out of the box. So
Yeah, I do think that last conquistador is going to help. Very lucky that they hit that with misfortune scales because that's like a 1% chance. But the Bakemono is actually kind of nice just because that gives them a large amount of resources for their capital, so it'll make it easier to pump out royal guards. And the Bakemono themselves are a
but
good
there's
stealth unit,
Kooni here
which
too.
Marignon doesn't normally
Like
have access
eight
to.
Kooni could just sandbag it with some crossbows.
That's true. And there's also the precision malice that you get for
Right.
fighting underground to consider. Yeah, given that you want crossbows in particular, that's actually harder
Yeah.
than I'd thought. Because I was going to say, like, oh, Bakemono, that, like, no problem. But you're using a ranged based army, which is not the
I
best
mean,
for
it could
fighting
be
advanced
fine. Like
units.
if you
So
had
yeah, that is really hard.
maybe 30 is enough, right? Like, but like if you have 40, it could be kind of trivial. Like shoot everybody. These guys can't block crossbows, right? And they're just dead. But then it's like
Yeah, that
you
force,
just don't kill quite enough, and the Kooni get melee, and you're like, fuck.
that
Ooh,
force
it's also
province
got
to
some
their
turmoil in here
southwest
for the
is
Kooni too. So yeah,
yep, and those are Marignon
he
scales.
did that to
He
himself.
did that to himself. So that force province to Marignon's southwest is relatively easy as
This
far as
one,
like
yeah,
population
this is
types
super
go.
easy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that might be the best one.
So that I wouldn't do
Right,
that with that particular army
right.
because you have so few units left.
Tough decisions.
And then the province to the south, yeah, the province to the south there is heavy cav,
I
which
just see
you
so
definitely
many
can't take.
paths with the end of them all being regret. So, and the other thing too is you have to consider if you're the player, like there's like plus or minus like 50% on a lot of these provinces. Like you're not really sure how much is there. And it's like so nail biting where you determine to send your guys.
Yeah, I think that if his expansion has any hope of working out, it's most likely going to need to come off the back of that hero
Yeah.
starting to lead parties.
How big is his retinue? That could be kind of
1d6.
significant. Especially if you put him up at the front and he's
Yeah, and they're
survivable.
also
That way
just
they could tank hits and stuff.
yeah, and the heavy crossbows
Right.
themselves are just very, very good units. So they're crossbows with armor, so they actually stay still, so they can serve as like a real
Okay.
solid anchor for
And
your
I hope we
army.
see that because I'm praying, thoughts and prayers for Marignon. They haven't fucked up
And
yet.
then
It
yeah, the other two
just,
folks
I
in this
feel it's
column,
like it's coming. It's all. It,
yeah, this is definitely one of the more challenging nations
yeah.
to expand with in general. You've done some videos on it
The
actually.
quick TLDR is use these guys.
Yeah. The other two folks in this column are both nations that, in my opinion, have actually very straightforward expansion in LA.
Yeah.
So with Agartha, you've got the Cave Knights, which they're making heavy use of, which are really cool because they're set, while they're not like cavalry in the traditional sense of being fast units, they do get the cavalry bonus of that
Mhm.
defense where they, don't take the penalty
Right.
from
I've got a 22 damage bite
hits.
attack,
They
which
have
is
great.
sick. Like, oh, hoofs. What about a
Mhm.
bite?
But the most important thing is that their second form is a very high hit point, very high
Yeah.
protection cave drake unit. So those are normally summoned. You do have to pay upkeep on them, so they're not perfect. But cave drakes in general are just so tanky and similar to how you can use like high protection units as like kind of an HP anchor. So even if the human units or whatnot gets routed, that your army stays put, the cave
Yeah.
drakes can serve a similar role where the drake will
Yep.
prevent your army from HP routing.
Yeah, they're really expensive,
And they're great
so they're
equally.
not an extremely gold efficient unit, but especially for expansion, they're a very efficient resource efficient unit. So
Yeah, and with a
great.
scale spell like this, you can afford them.
But in terms of like 35 resources, you're not going to find units which put out a ton more power, especially scales units that put out more power than a cave knight for 35 resources. We could probably come up with some, but they're very resource efficient.
Yeah, and then the other folks in this row are Midgard, which is just going to be doing elf expansion. I'd actually commented before that their elf expansion seemed very modest. Like by now, they should have more expansion parties out. I feel just because even with a very light bless and one which in my opinion doesn't really take full advantage of the strength of the veneer, which is their defense tanking. That I still think that like you can very easily make an expansion
Yeah.
party every turn.
I'm not really an elf expert, but that makes sense to me.
Yeah, basically you just put 5 veneer on bodyguard on van commander, and then you use some sort of bait, and then you basically just like charge at the back, and then the retreating guys can't hit you after you're out their
Right.
commander, just because they have that attack malice. And even if you like don't manage to get all commanders, just like if you hit their archer squad and deal a bunch of damage, you can
Okay.
HP out the indies very
Yeah,
quickly.
I'll have to play around with that. I don't know if I'm going to have an itch to play the elves anytime soon, but if I do, try to remember that.
Yeah, I one of the reasons that I like Midgard actually is that it is a very, very good scales nation that happens to
Mhm.
have elf expansion. So it's not really like a full-on elf nation where you have usually the major issue with playing elves is that your mages are very expensive
Yeah.
because all of them are thugs.
You've got Vola and
Uh,
stuff, but
Midgard
I
doesn't have
mean,
that. Yeah, you've got Volva for your cheap astral mages, and you have Galdermen, which are
right.
basically some of the best mages in the game. Like those are like high tier picks in those
Yeah.
like draft games that you guys
I
play.
wouldn't call them cheap though.
So
What are they? Yeah.
oh, they're not cheap.
Yeah.
No, the Volva are the cheap guys. The
Yeah.
Galdermen are the elite guys. Because those guys can hit Air 4.
Oh, they can't. I mean, okay.
Not like commonly, but like yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But they're all good, and they have like a bunch of these really interesting path options. Like you can get Earth magic from those guys, you get Death magic from those guys. They're blood hunters. Like they're just incredible mages. And because they're werewolf form, they can survive flames from the sky, which
Now
is
we
very
know that
uncommon.
TNG is already angling to attack Midgard.
Yeah, and with Midgard's small size right now, that
Right.
doesn't bode very well for them. And then Pan, another nation that's very easy to expand with. This is a nation that just has sacreds that basically just work out of the box, regardless of their bless, because of their awe. So, not amazing given their very mild bless,
The
but good enough.
formation was kind of nice
And the
too.
reason that he's
He
having them run forward,
kind of was a block. He made the squad split up, and so the guys that ran past ended up getting chewed up by the satyrs.
mm, I don't think it was perfect, just because his expensive sacred units did get hit first, and you kind of want to lose the satyrs that you get in your starting army. Because I mean, the satyrs that you
Yeah.
get in your starting army are awful. Like their only advantage is basically being stealthy, which you actually have a really
Yeah.
hard time taking advantage of in LA Pan compared to other eras. Mostly because like indies are much better, which means that
Right.
province defense is much better. Like if you're hitting armored units, these satyrs just aren't as good at raiding as they
Yeah.
are in EA and
Makes a
MA.
ton of sense.
It looks like he's making more of them, probably just because he needs the chaff, and he hasn't taken enough of his cap circle yet in order to get
Yeah,
those
I
high
think that
resource
makes
cost
sense.
units.
I mean, I think this is a solid strategy where you have the dryads kind of as the rock upon which like the waves of indies are breaking, and the satyrs to just clean up the mess behind them. I mean, it kind of sucked here. They lost two of the dryad hoplites. Like you said, they'd rather prefer attrition here. But the dryad hoplites are not very killy. They're single sacred with a lot of attacks. And while they're going to do fine in melee for a while, you don't really want them sitting there for like 8 turns, slowly killing stuff. Like you want a little bit more killing power, I think. So
Yeah, and depending on who you fight in your first war, they can either be
yeah,
really good or borderline useless.
versus
Because
good
against
troops, they've got what 13 damage
against
attacks or something stupid. Yeah, like these could be literally doing nothing.
yeah, and then the other issue that they run into is that they have fairly low protection,
Right.
so they can actually die to crossbows. So they basically are your expansion only unit in order to allow you to transition to
Right.
your cataphracts and snipers, which is what
Yeah.
you're probably going to want against play.
And that brings us back to Marignon, which brings us to the end of the turn. And we managed to finish this in under an hour. So what are your
Go us. Did we talk about
yeah.
Atlantis' expansion? I
We
think we
did.
might have skipped them. Oh no, you're right. We did. That they took.
We're talking mostly
Uh,
about the Ghost King.
actually, I don't know if we did. Yeah, we talked about the Ghost King.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to watch that expansion.
I
though.
pulled it up.
It's,
I think we watched it. I
yeah,
don't
very
think we
very
said
easy
much
indie
about it.
type. Oh, okay, yeah, but it's a very easy indie type, and yeah, just infantry hitting infantry. Not much to say.
Yeah.
The only thing I guess that we can say about that is that they're expanding towards Pythium. So it might be just that they want to grab that lake. That's the only thing I could think of for like why they would expand up that way first. They're probably thinking like, oh, Pythium can't take it. This is a wealthy water province, just because it's a little bit bigger. So they might want to think about like, making a fort there so they can start doing underwater research stuff in a place where their water can't be contested easily because Pythium isn't one of the amphibious nations. That's the only thing that I can think of for why they
Do
would
you
want to
think
go there
taking this
first.
water
But given
province
that they
would
weren't able to
antagonize
see,
Pythium, or do you think it would be like a token for which to kind of threaten them into signing a non-aggression pact or something?
Depending, it really, so I don't know what Atlantis' play style is or their diplomacy style, but the way that I would think about it is that this is like in terms of like map layout in Pythium's natural expansion area, but it's a water
Right.
province. Pythium can't actually take it. So what you could say is, I'm going to take this, but I'm not going to contest any of the other stuff which either of us could normally go for. And then that basically sets your border, and that gets you a safe underwater fort to start making your
Yeah,
forgiving
that's
fathers.
true. So you're saying like you would take this, but
But
maybe
again,
like
that
leave this alone for them or something.
yeah, something like that. I don't know. Again, I'm not. It really depends on like
Right.
the diplomacy
Right.
style for both of these players in terms of like what makes sense. But that's not a province that Pythium can take or contest, which
Yeah.
makes it
But I was
safe.
thinking like if
And I
Atlantis was
think
in
that
here,
like,
on one hand, I would be very annoyed as Pythium to have Atlantis this close to my cap, setting up shop underwater. On the
but
other
Atlantis is
hand,
gonna
right.
Atlantis
On
is
the
gonna
other
get there
hand,
anyways.
though, if he wants peace and I don't want to deal with this, and I can just stick my head in the sand and he'll give me like a long-term non-aggression pact or something, and I can go mess with somebody else. That sounds like a lot more fun than having his army jump in and out of this lake. Anyway,
It's also, yeah, I mentioned, I don't know what the like actual thoughts are. It might just be that you
yeah,
have that
it could
province because
be.
it had easy indies. Who knows, right?
I mean, these were pretty fucking easy indies. So, yeah.
Yeah. Jaguar, one of the easiest province types you'll even find in LA. So there
Yeah.
might just not be that much thought put into
All
it.
right. Well, I think we'll end it here. Certainly looking forward to see how the rest of expansion has gone. The only thing that might be a little anticlimactic about expansion is I feel like half these players already have half their borders negotiated. So we'll have to see.
Very true. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Sai. Viewers,
Yeah.
thank you for
Thanks for
tuning
having me.
in. See you next time.